Today, we are going to be talking about developing a skills first thinking across teams. And we're going to, in this exclusive, talk to our Chief Product Officer, Koreen Pagano, who has been spending the last couple of years working on
Years, definitely
on
years.
skills. Yes. And so I am really excited to get an opportunity to have Koreen share some things with us today about skills. I find this conversation really interesting because when we think about what we do in learning and development, we think, oh, yeah, we're trying to develop people's skills, their competencies. And we talk about all of these things as if they are the same. We talk about them in the same breath. And so I'm really interested to hear from you today, Koreen, how we should be thinking about skills and what is it about the work that we do that maybe we need to be thinking about a little differently? And so let's kick this off with a question because we are talking about teams today, right? And developing this thinking across your teams in the organization and why that's important. And so I want to kick us off with a question that actually I'm really interested in. How do we as employees or as folks that are doing different jobs, doing work, how do we know what a skill is or what a skill is supposed to be in our organization or in our work?
First, I know we only have 30 minutes. I could talk about this ad nauseum for days on end. So thank you for talking about skills today. I'm excited about it. I don't think employees do know what a skill is. I think it's one of the challenges of this whole skills-based organization movement and folks talking about skills is that there are oftentimes conversations that are happening in HR or L&D or talent and hiring recruiting or at the C-suite. But day-to-day folks that are in organizations working probably don't know what a skill is and don't know why there's all this hubbub about skills. So just a very basic definition of a skill is a thing that you can do. So that keeps it very broad because um because a lot of organizations think about how they define what a skill is for their organization slightly differently. And there are some categories of skills. Oh, I should mention I have a book coming out later this year called Building the Skills-Based Organization. It'll come out at the end of September. But in writing the book, I had to really think about how to break this concept down for folks to understand. So there's really three categories of skills. There's what people skills or human skills, or people used to call soft skills, but now that's fallen out of favor. And some people call them power skills. There's a whole variety of labels, but it's basically things that everyone does or applies on the job, no matter what your job is. So things like problem solving, communication, conflict resolution, creativity is being talked about as a skill now. Those are all things that everyone has in some degree. And so that's one category of skills. Another category of skills are technical skills. And those are like, how do you use the systems or the technologies or the things that are required for your job? And every job might have different technical skills associated with it. And then there are job skills. Those are really related to your job role, but not necessarily technology related. For project management, budgeting might be a job skill that you have to learn and develop over time. And those are ways that you can start to explain to folks like, hey, there's different capabilities that you have. There's different competencies. You mentioned there's all these different words that different organizations use. But if you think about all of those things in combination as the skills required for you to do the work to be done in your job, that's a basic definition of skill. But you asked a slightly different question, which is, how do employees know what a skill is? Which I started out saying, I don't think they do. And that's actually one of the challenges of moving to a skills-based organization is this can't be something that's done to employees. This has to be an initiative where people are brought into the conversation and brought along. And it's often an area like people get so wrapped up in what are the skills and do we need an ontology and what is the technology we need to support skills and all of those types of organizational questions that they often lose sight of the fact that you're talking about data related to your teams and your people and that they need to be part of those conversations as well.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question because we talk a lot of jargon in our industry. And one of the things, this I think was one of my first questions to you when you started working on the book, was what makes a skill different than a competency?
So if we're going to dig into like the data stuff, a skill is a task and it's usually pretty um defined and it's something you can observe, right? So I'm doing this thing and I can observe that I'm doing this thing and therefore I can measure that I'm doing that thing, which is actually really important for the skill conversation, that it's something that can be measured. Competencies, though, are usually an aggregate of skills that in combination help you do a more complex job. Project management could be a competency. Presentation skills might be competencies because that requires potentially data visualization and verbal communication. And maybe there's different skills that kind of bubble up in combination. The best example I like to use is leadership. And actually, in different organizations where I've worked, organizations would say leadership is a skill. I would argue leadership is a competency. It's an aggregate of a whole bunch of different skills, and that you might be a really strong leader in a couple areas and very weak in other areas. And that's where the skill piece becomes important because you can start to identify what am I really good at in this leadership umbrella and what do I struggle with. But some organizations want that credit score kind of measure of how good of a leader is Koreen or Sarah. And so that's where the organizational variability comes into play. Some organizations will say leadership is a skill, but we know that it's made up of other skills because they still want to talk about leadership as an umbrella term. But I would argue that's a competency.
And so I love this discussion because at Build Capable, we've worked with organizations a lot to try to help them figure out how to track how competent their workforce is. So they spend time putting together competency models, but very few organizations drill down to what are the demonstrable skills that folks need to have to show that they are competent in a given area based on however the organization defines that. Is that
Yeah.
kind of in line with
And
what you were
honestly, I
thinking?
think going back in history, and I'm old enough to remember the days when all organizations were investing in these really complex competency models. They'd hire consulting groups and they'd come in, and then the minute they would get the competency models done, all the jobs had changed, all the tasks, right? Like work had changed faster than organizations could create those models. And competencies for me are good umbrella buckets to describe chunks of more complex work to be done, but it's constantly changing. And the skills are constantly changing, and the tasks that at work are constantly changing. So it's hard, I think, if you are of a certain age and you lived through the competency model conversations. I do think competencies in some organizations is like a bad word because they were like, we spent all this money, we tried to figure this out, we couldn't figure it out. And part of the reason was that the measurable tasks, like skill to task analysis, wasn't really done and things changed too fast to think that you're going to build a model and then use that forever. So the good news now with technology is that we can create much more agile models. We can identify emerging skills. We can evaluate the tasks that folks are doing on the job and map that to if this is what you need to do, what skills do you need to have? So we're getting smarter, I think, and more agile in our ability to analyze these things, but it's a moving target. Like if anybody thinks they're going to set this up and then it's going to run forever, it's not. Like it's not the case. Like you really do need to be evaluating all the time what are the competencies needed and then what are the skills needed to support them.
I'm going to ask you a question that seems really obvious, but I want to dig into this because so the question is, as employees, how do folks know what their skills are? And the reason I'm really interested in this question is that when I think about how do employees know what their skills are? I'm like, okay, obviously people know what their skills are. But actually, I think that a lot of people don't know what their skills are. And a good example is this exclusive. When we started doing these, I have a habit of collecting rocks and tumbling them and cutting them. And I share them with my friends on YouTube. So I had done a lot of work on YouTube and didn't realize how many skills I had in video development and streaming and things like that from a hobby that I had. And so I'm really interested. Talk to us more about how do we know as employees what our skills are and maybe even what's relevant to the organization?
Yeah. So this is another like funny one because you think that people would know what they're good at. You would think that folks would know what their skills are, be able to talk about that in a meaningful way, but we really don't. Like, we don't. And to your point, there's skills that are related to the work that you're doing in your current job. There's skills that you developed in previous roles or previous jobs that you may or may not still have to some proficiency. And then there's all the things you do outside of work that you're building skills and doing things. I am an amateur barber and I am an amateur website developer, evidently, because I build websites randomly. But I would never list that or those things as skills that I have, but I've been doing it for years and years. So, do I talk about it? Would I articulate that? Probably not. Can I do them? Sure. So, this is a problem I think organizations have in general in bringing their employees along is that employees actually aren't very aware of or able to articulate what their skills are.
I think that's a really interesting way that you just described that because a lot of us have a lot of skills that we don't share.
Yeah.
And when I think about it for myself, sometimes to your point, Koreen, I don't share things sometimes because I may not feel like I have enough skill in that area to do it in a job. But I think a lot of what we do at work, especially around innovation, requires us to have this knowledge, like having skills in different areas, even if we're not at a high level of expertise.
Yeah. We were just talking before this started about I'm taking a Master Gardener certification class right now. And part of being part of that class is there are folks in there that majored in sciences, have either horticulture backgrounds or like specialists in like landscaping and all kinds of things. And then there's me who came in and was like, I love to garden. I don't know what I'm doing. And one of the things that we're learning as part of the Master Gardener program is that it's not actually about all of the knowledge about the subject area. It's about, do I have the skills to find the correct information that's research based that I can share with a community? And so the skills I'm developing in that class are actually around research and understanding sources and being able to communicate basic terms and public speaking and education, which obviously I have a background in learning. So that's a little bit easier for me. But again, would I talk about those skills in the context of work? Probably not. But I'm working constantly right now and improving my ability to cite sources and understand content on the web and the accuracy. I'd like to say that my Master Gardener class is all about gardening, but it's actually about understanding data and research and being able to communicate that data out to other folks who don't have it. All of that is just to say, so I'm an employee. Do I know what skills I have? I'm going to say for most of us, probably not. And you also asked part of that question, which was, do I know what skills I need or what my organization cares about? And also, for most people, probably not. There are some organizations that are making progress, but if you think about the resources that employees have had to understand their jobs and their roles, we've relied a lot on job descriptions, which I actually talk about this in my book. I talk to a bunch of people, organizations about their job descriptions for their organization. And I say, if you looked at your job descriptions right now, would they accurately describe the work that people are doing? And then everyone looks like a deer in the headlights, right? No, they're not accurate. And so we have imperfect information right now, even for employees to better understand what's expected of them, what the skills are that are required for them to be successful, and then to compare that to the skills that they have so that they can figure out this is the goal of L&D is to close the skill gaps and make sure people are prepared for the work to be done. And we have really bad data right now for employees to have insight into that, let alone L&D, let alone managers, let alone executives who are trying to understand their organization. And so in this environment of like, how do we bring teams into the conversation? Part of this is how do we start to collect data and information that two things. One, that accurately tracks their skills or is relevant to the skills that they need for their job. And second, how do we build trust in that data? Because one of the biggest challenges in this whole data conversation is not can you measure skills or infer skills, but will people trust that data to be accurate, an accurate representation of reality, and then use that data to make decisions or take action or leverage it? Because if you don't trust the data, you won't use it. And that's end of the day.
Yeah. And I want to actually dig into this a little bit. Jacob in the chat made an observation about what organizations care about. And they only seem to care about your past job descriptions, right? Or skills that you've obtained while working in a certain job. So how can you take these transferable skills from hobbies, like my YouTube example? How can you translate that into something that folks would recognize? And I think this is really getting into that question. How do we use our skills? The ones that we have, because I think we do know some of the things that we know. We just don't know if anybody cares about using them.
I love this question because it actually touches on a couple different things. One is that we have created a bias through the data that we have historically had on either degrees or education, formal education, certification programs, etc., or job history. The reality is that we are building skills all the time in all different contexts. There's a whole conversation online around hidden skills, which is things that we're learning how to do or we pick up that can be applied at work. There's a school of thought, which I don't ascribe to, but there are some folks that think that skills can only be relevant in context, that the skills that you're building are only meaningful if you apply them in a particular context. I don't believe that's true. I actually think there's a lot of crossover between skills obtained in one environment and then how you can apply them in new environments. While there might still be a delta of context, the bulk of the work is learning how to do the thing. Applying it in a new context is a smaller lift to get it relevant. And one example I always use is UX designers and graphic designers that are thinking about building visual assets. They might have a specialty in L&D UX or product UX, but if they needed to be applied to marketing campaigns or building out assets, the lift or the delta between those jobs is much smaller because they've got a lot of the background experience to be able to apply that in new contexts. We have a problem with the data that we're using. LinkedIn profiles are job history, resumes are job history and education. We are not talking about skills. We are talking about what companies you worked for and what job roles you had, and maybe some of your accomplishments. It's very limited information. Advocating for how do we make that better, right? The answer is actually doing a much better job of assessing skills and being able to measure and validate skills. There's lots of imperfect systems happening right now with skill inference because companies are so hungry for more data that they've said, okay, we're just going to try to infer as much as possible. But if you think about inference models, they're based on the data within systems. If you think about the Microsoft announcement last week that they're launching a skills data product, the data that they're pulling from are LinkedIn profiles, if you give them permission to, and the work that you're doing in your current job. So they're not getting any of that external data to inform. And so even some of the products and systems that we're using right now are repeating the same challenges and patterns that we have created for ourselves already. We always talk about like bad data equals bad decisions. We still do not have great data around skills. How do we get
Right.
better? Garbage in, garbage out. Have to think about how we actually measure skills differently than based on past experience.
I think that's a great point, and Cami has a really great point about there's such a vast ocean of possible skills, right? And what's most important to the organization, what's going to have the most impact on positive business results. One of the things that I think you've talked a lot about today is data. And
Yeah.
this has been a constant conversation in everything that is happening in not only learning technology, but just in technology in general in the world today, whether it's AI or whether it's skills or whatever, is data.
Yep.
Having the right data, having clean data to train models, to make decisions. This is not a new conversation, but it's definitely showing up in a much more dramatic way now that we have robots taking over. So I wanted to ask you about how do you see XCL helping in supporting skills, identifying what skills we need in the organization and whether we have those skills or not. How do you see XCL playing a role there?
Yeah. So I think that XCL has some unique opportunities in two ways. I'll start with the more kind of tangible, practical. If you need to shift your culture and bring your team members along in the conversation, it's really important to think about a skills education for your teams. And not only that, but really internally marketing skills. This isn't something that you can do one time. This is a culture shift. This is a conversation that you need to start having in an ongoing way with your team. And so XCL, as we know, it does a really good job of integrating in with enterprise systems and surfacing content and surfacing experiences in the flow of work, making it top of mind. You're not tied to one platform. You can start to think about how do you infuse internal education and skills marketing, which we could do a whole session just on that, into your employee experience so that people start thinking in terms of skills. They start interacting with their managers and their teammates in terms of skills, and they start to think about their own development and career pathing in terms of skills. All of that context is likely happening outside of a learning platform. And so XCL really allows you to integrate content and experiences and interactions across the enterprise in a way that it shouldn't be seen as learning. It should be seen as a full organizational culture shift. But the second and probably most important, arguably most important thing that XCL can do is give you much richer data about what people are doing in learning experiences and interactions and interacting with content. We all know the existing standards for learning gives you very limited information about what people are doing and to share. And if we are, especially in L&D, expected to better understand people's skills, better understand how they're getting better at something, and making that visible to the employees themselves, we need better data. We need the organization to understand what skills are developing, what skills are falling off. We need to know where there are gaps in skills. We need to also understand how skills are shifting across the organization so that we can invest in building those skill sets and the right folks. All of that data is really not captured in an LMS. And so if you're an organization that really is thinking about how do I move to really embrace the skills and skill data, it's not just about an ontology and it's not just about an assessment here or there. It's about infusing that information in every interaction so that you're collecting data. We talked about the garbage in, garbage out. I saw somebody posted that in the chat. So we have to start with how do we not have garbage data and how do we start collecting meaningful data? XAPI as a standard is much more flexible and allows you to collect a variety of different data. You can define what it is you want, and XCL makes it easy to do that without figuring out all the XAPIs. so that you can wrap your experiences with the XCL wrapper, track what's happening, and then get that data in. You mentioned training models. AI is only as smart as the data you're giving it. If you're not capturing deeper data, then your models aren't going to be very smart. And so really thinking about this in terms of skills is 100% going to be a catalyst for organizations that are moving in a skills direction. And if you follow any folks that talk about skills, I try to follow every person that talks about skills on LinkedIn. But if you follow the conversation, there's so much intersection now between skills and AI and how AI can help make these processes easier. But at its core, data is still the biggest challenge. And that's, I think, what XCL can really easily do for organizations that want to get better at data.
Yeah, this is where I want to get on my soapbox and talk about how fundamentally we have to think about how people learn and how people demonstrate what they've learned. And they do that through the work that they do and the things they do every day. We know this, we've always known this, but some of the things that we've had from a technology perspective, time and resources, have always made that difficult to do the thing that we know is best for learning and demonstrating skills. Because you
Yep.
can't have a person stand beside every single person who's knowledgeable and have that on the job training type approach. One of the opportunities we have is to rethink how we teach people and how people access information. So you have all these new tools. You have AI powered tools that can allow you to interact in different ways. You have systems that we can practice in and we could capture data directly from folks' work. We have a perfect opportunity right now to be collecting data from the things that folks are doing every day to demonstrate what they're doing. And one of the purposes of XCL, and perhaps one of the main goals of XCL, is giving people a way to get all of that data in one place, because it is not realistic to funnel everybody through a learning management system.
The quality of the data is one aspect of, is it measuring the information or the things that you need to aggregate to make decisions? But the standardization of that data is what's needed to really help train models, because you could throw a bunch of contextualized content and data into an AI model and the results will vary in terms of what you'll get out. But if you have more structured data that you're training your model on and it's consistent over time, now suddenly that model is getting smarter. It knows what to expect. It's synthesizing data easier. It doesn't have to make sense of the chaos because you've already done that in a standardized way. It can just look at the data and help you make better decisions and give you insights that you wouldn't otherwise be able to surmise. The point well taken about, like, it's not just can we measure more stuff, it's standardizing that data in a way that we can actually channel it easily into the other systems that will help us make better choices.
And I think that for the folks that are in learning platforms that they love, that they're using for certain purposes, and that give them the ability to capture that standardized data in an XAPI format, which is, you just have to have that now. You cannot rely on score and pass fail data. It's not going to get you into a skills based organization. But I do think that considering how XCL can play a role in that and extend those capabilities, even when you do have a learning platform, to standardize those data and collect data from more than just SCORM packaged e-learning.
Honestly, XCL is such a low entry way to experiment, to get better data, and whether you have a platform or not, to your point, like, you might already have a platform and you've got all your systems set up and it's not going anywhere. And that's not great for skills. What it is, what it is. If the context is skills, then you're beholden to the capabilities of that platform to be able to translate into skill data. But if you're really struggling and you have specific use cases or specific needs, Cami mentioned, keep it narrowly focused, focus on business problems to solve. Like, all of those things are really important. You can start to experiment with getting better data through XCL for those specific use cases. And then you can start to, over time, see how your entire ecosystem might shift to be more data centric and get more quality data. But XCL is such a low entry way to help organizations reimagine what that might look like. I'm obviously excited to be working on it because when I talk about the skills conversation and the challenges that I see in our existing systems, this is one of the biggest ones, and XCL can help make it so much easier.
I have to thank you this time for being our guest for this week's exclusive. I have learned so much from you today. So thank you for taking the time to share with us what you've been learning about skills in your research for your book. We're looking forward to your book coming out, and I will post that link in the comments for the video and also in the recording on our YouTube playlist. Thank you all for joining us today. We will talk to you next time.